Hey everybody, this is Isaiah and welcome back to Magic System Monday. And today I want to talk about something that I've been avoiding talking about for a really long time because I've had so much difficulty over the years trying to frame it in a way that makes sense. But despite that, I want to try my best to talk about it anyway because when people consult me about their magic systems, or when I review someone else's magic system that they give me, this often ends up being the part that the writers themselves are most attached to or most satisfied with if they're pretty good writers. And that would be the concept of metas. The meta is an ecosystem, not strictly of the powers that characters have access to and how available they are and what they do, but rather what people know about those abilities, whether it's their abilities or abilities of people around them or even their enemies, and how their understanding of those abilities informs their choices, whether it's them getting better at using their own capabilities, or whether it's them trying to find ways around things that enemies would try to do to them. Naturally, in a system with a lot of different powers or techniques that are available to the characters, people are going to try their best not only to understand their powers and their enemies' powers, but also to make use of that information to the best of their ability. This doesn't mean that everyone's going to make perfectly optimal choices, and it doesn't mean that everyone's going to have infinite knowledge or intelligence to make the thing that makes the most sense. But it's important for writers to understand that this ecosystem of choices and consequences and reactions is one of the most integral parts of your world building and, by extension, the cohesion of the magic system. Not only do you have to make people's powers and abilities and choices make sense on the individual scale, but once you zoom out to the world at large that you've written in your story, you have to sell the viewer on the idea that the whole thing makes sense. And the best way of doing that is using your common sense as a writer and thinking about all the powers that people have and how they will react to them if they have the possibility. Now on the small scale, we have examples like Monkey D. Luffy. The neat part about Monkey D. Luffy is he ate the Gum Gum fruit. The Gum Gum fruit makes his body incredibly stretchy, and while this isn't a normal capability that most people have, this does, as a result, give him access to new capabilities. We later learn, and by later I mean after a really long time, we learn that he never fully understood his capabilities, but at the end of the day, he used what information that he had, even though it was limited, to try to make use of his power the best way he possibly could. And that naturally caused his style to change. Instead of using things like normal martial arts, he decided the best thing to do was use the tension and stretch that he could build up to not only increase his speed, but also increase his striking force. As a result of that stretchiness, he can push his body in ways that other people can't. On the large scale, we have things like Genjutsu. Genjutsu in Naruto is a very prominent part of that world and the combat. That regardless of how strong you are as a ninja, this is just a risk that you're always going to have to deal with in combat. If someone gets off a really good Genjutsu on you, with Genjutsu being a type of illusion, then if you can't combat it, it's basically game over. It might even be an instant loss. But because most of the powers in Naruto operate off of the concept of chakra, the energy system that people control in that world, people learned over time that Genjutsu is effectively injecting chakra into the brain to alter a person's brain waves. But the common sense of chakra control tells us that flow of energy can also be disrupted. And so people's typical response is to train how to disrupt that flow of chakra in their own body by using their own chakra control. And this doesn't mean that everyone is always going to be successful with that, but it's a simple example of people using the information they have access to, regardless of whether or not they know everything about their opponent's capabilities or even the exact nature of the Genjutsu itself. They have a basic understanding of how those abilities work because they've existed in that world for so long, and then they use their own capabilities that they have to try their best to formulate a response. So metas are often defined not only by people understanding their own power to the best of their ability, learning things about it and learning how to use it as effectively as possible over time, but also people learning how other powers work and then doing their best to compromise with those abilities over a course of time as well. For example, you can even see this in individual fights. I mentioned Genjutsu a moment ago. To build off of that example, we have characters like the Uchiha clan. The Uchiha clan in Naruto possess a unique power called the Sharingan. The Sharingan does a number of things, but it also gives them their own unique types of Genjutsu. They have the power to inject Genjutsu into people strictly by making eye contact with them. If you don't know this, it could be a game ender immediately for you. But what characters started learning was, the last thing you need to be doing is to be making eye contact with them in combat. people learn the hard way that doing that sometimes is basically an instant loss, and they use their common sense to not do that anymore. Now, unfortunately, it isn't that simple, and there are more things I'm leaving out, but I'm just trying to give you guys a basic example of how this happens both on the small scale and on the large scale. People will naturally adapt to their own abilities and the abilities of their opponents. So in this case, the checks and balances exhibited in the world will naturally emerge and develop on their own. That is, of course, assuming your work of fiction has good governance. And when you master this idea as a writer and world builder, you provide yourself the opportunity to create a world that is not only unique to the exact powers and rules that you've created, but you also become an excellent practitioner of the concept of cause and effect. And that is crucial if you want your world to be believable. Now, as this progresses, naturally you're going to build an ecosystem of norms and techniques that are more common because of how useful they are, and the world is going to be built based off of that for the most part. But that does not necessarily mean that every individual character is going to be based off of what is most useful or most common in the meta. Sometimes you don't have access to all of the powers that people perceive as useful. And as a result of that, you simply have to work with what you have. When I say that you have to get good at building a meta, I don't mean that everyone's going to have the exact same powers. It's simply not going to happen. Now, while I think the examples I've given you are okay thus far, they're ultimately very small-scale examples. In order to sell you on the idea of the importance of metas, and how they can affect the story if you do them properly, I'm going to try my best to give you the best example I could possibly give you. And that would be the Mistborn Era 1 trilogy. Now, the Mistborn trilogy has a number of different magic systems in it, but the one I'm referring to now is the most common one, referred to as allomancy. Allomancy revolves around the consumption of metals. There are a number of different metals in the magic system that have power within them, and if an allomancer is to consume that metal and metabolize it in their body, they can gain access to that power. However, not every allomancer has access to every power. Allomancers themselves are split into two categories. There are Mistings, who can only harness the power of one metal, and then there are Mistborn, who have access to all of the allomancy-based powers, and they often use them in tandem, which makes them very, very dangerous and very powerful, although they are extremely rare. There are a number of different powers in allomancy. Some of them are very good in combat, and some of them are just utility-based abilities. For example, those who burn tin gain access to enhanced senses. Their sense of smell, vision, and hearing are much more powerful than the normal person's. It's also exceptionally useful in the world of Mistborn specifically, because at night the entire world is covered in the dense fog, and those who utilize tin have the miraculous ability to see through that mist. However, utilizing tin also enhances one's ability to sense pain. So, at least on its own, it's not a very useful power in combat, and is mainly relegated to utility. On the other hand, there are powers like Pewter that are extremely meta for combat. They enhance one's physical capabilities, like their durability, their strength, their speed, their equilibrium. Pewter also grants a person not only the ability to recover and regenerate quicker, but also the ability to both resist pain and exhaustion. Those who utilize Pewter are often sought after in the world of Mistborn. But then there are also a couple of powers that, interestingly enough, are able to manipulate metal by either propelling it away from oneself or pulling it towards oneself. And these can not only be used to weaponize metals, but they can also be used to turn your enemy's weapons against them. And it effectively allows you to gain control of your enemy in combat by either shooting them away from yourself very quickly to wound people, or pulling metals towards you so that you can utilize them yourself. This means that having any type of metal tool can become a liability in the face of allomancers and, more specifically, Mistborn. Because they possess all of these powers, they can use them in a way that no one else can. They have a certain level of agility to them that no one else can match, not only being able to propel themselves away from metal and repelling metal to protect themselves defensively, but also being able to pull metals towards them or pull themselves towards metals. They can effectively fly through the city like Spider-Man. This is even more dangerous at night. It effectively becomes death from above. They become the ultimate soldiers, so this produces a bit of an issue in the world of Mistborn. Obviously, these allomancers, especially the ones that can fight, are heavily sought after, and you want to acquire as many of them as you can for your own fighting force. However, they are extremely rare. So what happens when you're fighting allomancers, more specifically those who can either control metal or are a Mistborn? All of a sudden, any type of metal tool that you've prepared to defend your soldiers will immediately become a liability. What do you do with that? Well, obviously, many of your forces will still have to use metal weapons and armor, right? There's just no way around that. Because if they didn't, if an enemy force were to attack them with metal weapons, they would have the advantage. So getting rid of metal is not an option. However, the way that most noblemen decided they were going to mitigate this issue was training select forces to be able to combat allomancers. Those who burn pewter are incredible combatants. However, most of their advantages are only really well utilized in melee combat. So as a result, people started attacking them from a distance, with arrows. However, many arrows have steel tips in them, correct? Well, the easy way of solving that would be to use arrows that are stone tipped. Now they're no longer a liability in combat if you have an allomancer that's working against you who can control metals. Otherwise, they can use their ability to control metal to deflect those arrows. But as far as close range is concerned, those who burn pewter are not invincible. They can be jumped, just like anyone else. Another thing that forces that are specifically trained against allomancers do is to use wooden weapons. They take dueling canes and wooden shields that are treated to be as hard as possible, and they use those in combat instead. In fact, most pewter users often use wooden weapons as well. That way they can't be disarmed in combat or killed with their own weapons. So these techniques are not only used by those fighting against allomancers, but also a lot of allomancers themselves, because they realize the risk involved when using metal weapons. Now let's talk about what the Mistborn do to respond to these things. Oftentimes, Mistborn are so powerful that one of the only things that can really stop one Mistborn is another Mistborn. So as a result of that, they have to worry about how to fight each other as efficiently as possible. The powers that allow you to manipulate metals also allow you to sense them, meaning that carrying around metals is a liability. However, some Mistborn find metals so useful that they carry them anyway in the form of coins, because they can not only use them as projectiles when they push them away from themselves, but they can also put them on the ground and jump off of them to send themselves high in the sky. And many fights with other Mistborn revolve around people trying to use each other's coins against them. It's kind of like a game of checkers with coins. However, most Mistborn did not take that risk when it comes to their metal weapons. While normal combatants in the world may utilize either a sword or a spear, Mistborn use daggers, more specifically daggers made of either glass, obsidian, or stone. Not only can those daggers not be detected by their enemies, they also can't be used against them mid-combat. Now this does come with risks, of course, because obviously glass, obsidian, and maybe even stone weapons are easily breakable. The neat thing about this is that because Mistborn can also utilize pewter, their dexterity is drastically increased, and they can use those weapons much more efficiently than normal people can, meaning that the probability of those weapons being damaged is actually reduced. Now while I mainly made this video to refer to combat, it is worth noting that there are some powers in the world of Mistborn that are actually not considered meta in any capacity. For example, there exists one power that, while it doesn't directly help you in combat, it is an interesting utility choice. If I'm not mistaken, the power comes from bronze. It allows one the ability to sense when another allomancer around you is using allomancy, and what type of allomancy that they're using if you're skilled enough. You'd think this would be extremely useful, right? Because it would give you interesting intel on the enemy. Most allomancers like to burn at least a little bit of their power at any given time. That way they gain access to the utility it brings them. So you'd think that those who utilize bronze, who are referred to as seekers, would actually be able to spot allomancers extremely easily. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case, because those who utilize allomancy for themselves are often aware of the risks of being sensed. They employ another type of allomancer referred to as a smoker. Smokers have the ability to create an area of effect around them that dispels one's ability to sense allomancers. It also negates allomancy that is capable of affecting people's emotions, which is also a thing that exists. And the neat thing is, it doesn't matter how many allomancers are around using their power. If one smoker has his power activated, then a seeker's ability to sense powers being used is more or less completely negated. So despite the fact that seekers are theoretically very useful, the vast majority of the time they're kind of useless because they have the most easily negated power of the entire bunch, and they also don't possess any extra combat capabilities. At least 10 users who enhance their senses can't have that ability negated on the spot, and if it ever becomes a liability to them, they can simply turn it off. When it comes to Seekers, the vast majority of the time, assuming the enemy is remotely prepared, they simply don't get to use their ability at all. So out of all of the powers in Mistborn, this one is the least meta. Now, one of the things I like most about the meta in Mistborn is that not only is a lot of it obvious, these are obvious solutions that people would use to sort of get around the risks of their enemies' powers and to best utilize their own powers. But the key thing to me is a lot of these strategies that are utilized exist before the main characters come into the picture. These are things that are already prevalent strategies within the world. While some writers might be tempted to just have the world be a normal world and then try to make the main characters look smart by allowing them to invent strategies that no one else uses, this writer had the common sense to understand that this is something that people would have eventually come up with long before the main characters existed. I feel like a lot of works of fiction sabotage the logic of the rest of the world by trying to make their main character look smart by having them do something that people should have already been doing. And if you'd like examples of that issue, you can go watch 4 out of any 5 isekai and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But in the meantime, that's all I've got today. If you need me, you know where to find me. This is Isaiah from Magic System Monday, and I'll see you guys later.